Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Great to see you.
Great to be with you, Glenn.
So I was thinking today about your legacy in the Republican Party as a longtime congressman in Texas, as a two-time presidential candidate. And I was thinking about it as essentially a full frontal assault, a challenge of the various orthodoxies of the Republican Party, the longtime orthodoxies on a wide range of issues, certainly including foreign policy and the neoconservative wing that dominated Republican politics for a long time. The idea that the U.S. fights too many wars, we pay for the wars of foreign countries way too often when our national interests are at stake. To me, it seems like Trump in 2016 picked up on a lot of the ideas that you were actually spreading in 2008 and 2012, at least in terms of the campaign promises he made. And I'm wondering, as you look at today's Republican Party, how much progress do you think has actually been made in moving away from conservatism, to neoconservatism, to a more anti-interventionist foreign policy?
Yeah, I think there has been advancement because I talk about the difference between what it was like when I first went to Washington. You know, it was the money issue of 1971 and closing of the gold window. That sort of thing got me interested in Austrian economics. So I was first elected in 76, and I now look back sometimes and they'll ask similar questions and they'll want me to compare it. And I think there's a big difference because when I first went in, nobody was talking about Austrian economics. Libertarianism was barely mentioned. And there was essentially, you know, there wasn't a Mises Institute that was leading the charge on Austrian economics. So I would say there's great growth. But when people say, and you know, and I come down on the side of, I want to be optimistic. The Glenn Greenwalds are around; they're coming alive, you know, and I think this is just great. But others, typical Republicans, will say, yeah, but it's a mess and all this stuff, and they're very, very negative. But Leonard Reed, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, did a lot to help me understand this. He says it's not a numbers game. It's not a numbers game at all, you know. Eventually you need attitudes, prevailing attitudes, but it's you don't convert 51% of the people. What you want is to look for special people who are willing to stand up at a PTA meeting and say what everybody else is thinking. So the leadership issue is the thing, and I think that's where we're making progress. I think there's a better understanding of Austrian economics. There's going to be a great necessity, and there is right now. I think more people say own gold than today for wanting to protect themselves than say in 1933 when the gold was confiscated and nobody really cared that much. So I think there's a lot of progress, but as much as I like to see that progress, I still think we live in very, very dangerous times.
Absolutely. No, I think when people think about your presidential campaign and if people go back and look at the debates, it's really remarkable the extent to which you were isolated on that stage with candidates like Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney, these very conventional Republicans, and the lobbyists who filled those debate halls would boo what you were saying on things like the Iraq War and 9/11. And yet you did much better than I think people expected. And you were going into very red districts in places like Iowa and South Carolina, not just with libertarian economics, but also with this foreign policy message that at the time was not very popular in the elite class, that we were fighting too many wars under the name of the war on terror, that it was costing ordinary Americans a huge amount of their resources and quality of life because how much we were enriching arms industry for all these wars that weren't in our interest, including obviously the Iraq War, but so many other. Did you find that ordinary Republican voters in these deep red places were more receptive to that message than you had anticipated? Or what was the reaction when you started kind of inveighing against neoconservatism that at the time was dominant in the Republican Party under Bush and Cheney?
I see it in two groups. And I say, if you're talking about the Chamber of Commerce, no, I wasn't cutting into that. But amazingly enough, I felt optimistic about going to the liberal universities, you know, where the young people came out and they figured that they were radical left, they would listen, and they were much more open-minded. So I was encouraged by that. But when the conventional Republicans would come up to me and they say, well, we're going to do this and and that was early on. They thought they should just threaten me to behave and that sort of thing. And I said, well, I want to do a comparison. You have we have a constitution, you take an oath to it, but I didn't put the pressure on them there, which I would, but not necessarily. But what I would do is take out their their document, the platform, and I said, I'll contest you because the Republican platforms sometimes had some good stuff in it, and I said, why don't you compare the votes on that? But the war issue is a big issue. And I think what I tried to work on is they made it so that if you didn't go along with all that, evil, you were unpatriotic. And that's what they played on. And I think we sort of cut into that. I remember the time once on a debate, Giuliani type thing, they would say, oh, you don't support the troops and all this stuff. Yeah, it just happened. I was drafted and served 5 years in the military, and I was collecting more money from the military than they were. So I think that resonated, that people loved that stuff because they hadn't heard it before. So I think I changed that a little bit, that if you don't vote for it, even now the NDAA, the vote there is we used to get on that kind of stuff, if we got 10 or 12 votes, it was a big deal. Now there's an argument going on. Maybe we shouldn't send more money to Ukraine. Maybe we should think about protecting our borders. Maybe we should spend that at home, and this sort of thing. So the attitude, I think, has changed, but I still think the big issue when it comes to our policies and all is the fact that the debt is too big, malinvestment is horrendous. We have invaded so many countries. We have an empire that's going bankrupt, losing credibility. I believe that nothing happens until it's liquidated. And then there's a reestablishment or a rebirth of the energy. And I see the rebirth coming and the enthusiasm, but we still have a ways to go. And that to me is what we have to keep working on, because I believe there's a sentiment out there. I think people, when I start talking about, nihilism and, telling the truth all the time, and these people, they live by telling lies. I think most decent people want to hear that. And sometimes they need a little encouragement, but sometimes the people who get to express themselves on the media, and all about journalism and what you have to go through, but if you had 50 people that you might have come along with in journalism, you and two other ones might be the ones telling the truth, but you might be the only ones that people really respect. The other ones, they have to sell their soul in order to make a living. So to me, the numbers are not the game. It's speaking the truth, and there's an audience out there. So that's the reason I'm encouraged.
Yeah, I'm sure you saw this controversy recently where people rediscovered the Osama bin Laden letter to Americans in 2002, explaining that the reason Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, the reason there was so much anti-American sentiment, wasn't because they hated us for our freedoms, but because they hated that we were bombing their countries and imposing dictatorships. And there was a lot of pressure. TikTok had to ban any discussion of that letter. They didn't want people reading that. And I remember you having that kind of exchange with Giuliani and the other Republicans on the stage, where you were trying to say, look, if we go around the world with these wars, we're going to pay a cost. People are going to want to attack us back like on 9/11. And that was a taboo subject. You were accused of being pro-terrorist and justifying 9/11, and it was just funny that there was this recent controversy where people discovered the bin Laden letter. Let me ask you about a couple of the wars that we're actually fighting now. That you alluded to one in Ukraine. Before I get to that, I want to ask you about the one in Israel, because this is a country, Israel, that has received more foreign aid from the United States over the last several decades than any country by far, even though American generals often say that it endangers our national interest to be so tied to Israel and the region, given what they're doing to the Palestinians. The minute the war started, Biden depleted our own stockpile and sent all kinds of weapons that Israel wanted, asked for another $14 billion in aid to Israel on top of the billions of dollars we give them every year. And other than a couple of members of Congress in the Republican Party, there's really no opposition at all to this attempt to pay for yet another Israeli war with American resources. What do you make of this new war in Israel and Gaza and of Biden's posture toward Israel and saying, whatever you need, we're here to give it to you?
Well, I think we've made some inroads because the debate is a little bit different, and people are starting to say we shouldn't keep sending it to them. And it always ends. Our side always wins, but it's painful because, you know, the runaway inflation and debt ends. The markets are powerful, and they end, and it's tragic because a lot of innocent people suffer. But all this ends, and the empire ends, and the people know this. But no, the one thing is I as a libertarian have an easy way to answer when you talk about that war. Well, what you should do? Should you veto the peace in the resolution in the UN? Should you send more help to the Palestinians, or should you help Israel? They end up helping everybody. And of course, our approach is, well, we got ourselves into that, and bin Laden was very explicit about that. You know, he listed three things: it was the bombing, it was the Palestinians, and it was having troops in Saudi Arabia. And I would use that as the reason. And actually, that blowback principle, I was able to quote the CIA. They're the ones who originally brought the term up. They said, you know, there'll be blowback. But then when they found out that it wasn't popular to say that, there was only a few of us that were then speaking out, you know, and saying there's an explanation. What made me upset about that whole mess, and continue to do, whether it's Ukraine or whatever, they don't ask, you know, why did they do it? And you brought this question up. Why did we do this? With Israel and others. Why do we send it? What's the motivation? And bin Laden is a motivation, but they never ask that question. Why did the terrorists bomb us? And what happens if somebody gets murdered or there's riots and all these things? Who killed whom? They'll dissect it out on social terms, and they'll ask who did this, and see if they can politicize it. But they'll ask who did it and why did they do it. There's always one looking for a motive, but they did not ask for a motive. And you brought up the subject. Well, they should, you know, we should talk about motives, because that's how governments get away with this. And it's easy to control the people if they have, access to the people who are in charge of the media. And you understand that very well, how you can influence people. But, I understand the frustration, but I also understand that when I run into a Glenn Greenwald, I'm excited about it, because our message is getting out there. At least, not that we would agree on everything, but stop and think about it. And that's where the problem is, and that's where I think the hope is. It's also the reason I stay involved in education. I have, a small effort in my homeschooling, but we reach a lot of people interested in finding out the truth. I think that's the mandate that we have. We have to do our best. If you want to pay any attention or contribute anything, you have to be willing to search for and find out what the truth is all about.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting. As soon as the war in Eastern Europe broke out with the Russian conflict with Ukraine, it was very interesting to me that the only opposition to funding the war in Ukraine, the way Joe Biden immediately said he wanted to do with NATO, did come from parts of the Republican Party that have become more anti-interventionist. I interviewed a lot of members of the Republican Congress over the last couple of years, where only not one Democrat voted no. Every Democrat, from AOC and Ilhan Omar to Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer, and everyone in between, were yes, let's fund the war in Ukraine. But the no votes came from this anti-interventionist wing of the Republican Party, and I did look at that as progress, and I did look at that as kind of a legacy of, in part at least, your efforts in the Republican Party. And I would talk to them, and they would say things like, look, we have too many problems at home. We have too much national debt. We can't afford to fund the wars of foreign countries. They would say Ukraine is not the 51st American state. This isn't our war. And every time they would say that to me, Congressman, right, and this was before the Hamas attack, I would say, well, does that same rationale apply to Israel? In other words, it's great to hear you saying we shouldn't be funding Ukraine's wars. We have too many problems at home. Do you say that for Israel as well? And they would immediately start stumbling and looking for reasons why Israel was different. Why do you think that so many Republicans, even the ones willing to stand up on Ukraine, are not willing to do the same when it comes to questioning why we fund Israel's wars?
Well, I think it's an atmosphere. It's an attitude that's been around for a long time because who's controlling the message? Because if you say something that sounds like I'm not ever going to vote for a foreign aid for Israel. Well, that's anti-Semitic, and you're a monster then. But if you say the best way to solve this, you don't send money to either side. You don't send money to the Palestinians, and you don't send money. You don't have an empire, and you don't do that. Just think, it amazes me how many times have some American units, military units, been hit in the last couple months? Is it over 100 times? And people are saying they're bombing Americans and we have to do more. When I was trying to stop the march to war in the Middle East under Bush, I made them to vote on a declaration of war. Just to put it on record, I said, if you guys want war, you have to vote for it. And boy, that I was on the committee for that, and boy, did they hit me hard on that. They said they've been attacking us. I said, you have to have an aggression against us. They have been. They've been aggression. They've been shooting at our airplanes. Our airplanes are flying over Iraq, bombing, and they decided that was aggression against America, and it just fly by. So total ignorance, and that's why we need to. We need to keep working on building the people who are sending the message out, and we need to cultivate a lot more good journalists. I'll tell you that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's so interesting. We hear in these news reports, American bases in Syria and Iraq have been attacked again with the flare up in the region, and I think a lot of people say, wait, we have military bases in Syria and Iraq still? Why do we have those there? And when did Congress approve those? It's just such a kind of normalized part of our discourse that we just have troops in essentially every country. One of the other challenges that you frequently defended in challenging Republican orthodoxy was on civil liberties as well. And I think it's very clear that there's more space than ever in the Republican Party to do things like harbor skepticism for the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security, especially the ways in which they interfere in our domestic politics, spy on our American citizens, the NSA for sure. Do you think that newfound skepticism in the Republican Party is due to the fact that those agencies seem to have targeted President Trump and tried to undermine his presidency? Or do you think there's a more principled awakening on the part of parts of the American right about how pernicious and dangerous these agencies are when unleashed on our own citizenry?
Yeah, I think it's always been both. It has been less genuine until recently. I think it's getting that way. And, I get a chuckle out of it. Now they're deciding on whether the president or Trump is allowed to be on the ballot. And every once in a while, you'll get a Democrat that doesn't fall in line, and he has the right answer. He says, "Do you know that you can do it against us too?" They're starting to look at it, and not that they've come to a good position, but they're getting to see if this goes on, it's going to spread and make it worse. When 9/11 occurred, it was within hours they started talking about the Patriot Act, and within a day or two they had it on the floor. And there was essentially really no debate at all. It had been written a while back, and there was somebody sitting beside me, and a friend, and who frequently would vote with me. And I said, and he was voting no and yes, and I was voting no. I said, what are you voting yes for? You know that this is bad. He says, yes, but how am I going to go home And after 9/11, and tell my constituents that I voted against the Patriot Act. He says, and he just threw up his hands. He surrendered to it. And all I did tell him, I says, well, that's your job. Go back home and explain it.
Yeah, you represented a not exactly left-wing district in Texas and managed to keep going back and getting reelected, even while you were taking these positions so contrary in so many ways to Republican Party orthodoxy. Another area where you did that is the war on drugs and the general idea that we are imprisoning more of our population than any other country in the world. And it's so funny how often perceptions are distorted because of the media. So it was actually Joe Biden who, probably more than anybody in the Senate, played a leading role in kind of constructing the legal architecture that led to the war on drugs, people being incarcerated in huge numbers for possessing drugs, including just the prison industrial system in general. And it was Donald Trump who signed one of the first criminal justice reform bills in many, many years. I'm wondering whether you think, with rising crime rates in our cities and the perception that our cities are falling apart, that there's still potential progress that can be made in reducing some of these laws that are just still imprisoning American citizens in mass, and what kind of work is still needed on those issues?
Well, they're still working on it, and they pick different drugs to, accuse them of. And fentanyl is a little bit harder to defend. Let's just make it legal. And no, because marijuana is legal now, and for the most part, and that has made it so people didn't have to kill each other. But fentanyl is a little touchier subject. But I think you apply all those rules together, and it's trying to compare it to that. I said, how many? And I found some articles, and I don't know how accurate this is, but the principle is, more people die from alcohol and related diseases and accidents and everything else they do from fentanyl. So, and if I tell people that, I said, "What? Do you want to go back to prohibition?" Oh no, we don't mean that, because 92% of I don't know what the percentage. A lot of people in Congress drink alcohol.
That's for sure.
So they're not going to change that. But I think it's a job. But I think you can apply the same rules to all of it, because everything is dangerous. You might put it up to to a conservative that wants to regulate the drugs, and yet you say, well, do you think a lot of people died? But the liberals tell us a lot of people die unnecessarily with guns. I said, why don't we regulate these guns and do something about the guns? Oh no, that's different. When we were early on, we had a debate, and I was debating in a friendly way a very liberal congressman from Texas, and he was against the reintroduction of registration for the military, and I voted with him, which people hadn't figured me out yet, and he was still so amazed about this, and because I made a statement. I said, why are you guys, my conservative Republican friends, why do you want to register people? You won't even register your guns. So this liberal came up, he says, boy, I wished I had thought of that one.
Yeah. Sometimes it just takes confronting people with their principles, and it is hard to get people to reconcile those. I have a couple more questions, just in the limited time that we have. I want to respect your time. I want to ask you about China, because I do have a lot of conservative friends, people who come to my show. We have a lot of agreement. They seem to have a really anti-interventionist perspective now. They don't think the United States should be fighting as many wars, but there's always one country that the security state can feed people and say, no, this is the really dangerous country. And I think there is still a perception on the part of a lot of conservatives that even though a lot of these countries we're presented with, like Russia, aren't real threats, China is a real threat to the United States, and maybe we need to have a Cold War, even a hot war over Taiwan. What is your view of the proper relationship between the United States and China? Do we see them as an enemy, a competitor, a potential trading partner? How do you see the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I think the hawk Republicans are a little bit confused on this because it is true. China's a competitor, and we ought to watch them because they're taking our dollars and they're investing them overseas. They're better investors than we are. You know, what do? We spend it all on the military and go around the world, and we're going broke. And they go and they invest overseas, and then our people complain a whole lot. Oh, you know, they have control of this and this and this. No, I think there's way too much China bashing. I was in high school during the time of the Korean War was going on. I was drafted during the Vietnam War, and the Korean War was just, you know, never made any sense to me, and yet that was one of the big things that they had the Korean War, and we had to, you know, it was terrible because one of my teachers got redrafted, went over there and got killed. That was part of my growing up about this issue. But the Korean War, what I want to say about that was it brought to light Nixon and that bad guy Kissinger, you know. And now there's, you know, all this, any chance they can bash China, they do. But China is very competitive. And how did they get all our money? Well, we failed to satisfy our consumers at the right price for the right product. So we all went and bought all that stuff from China. And then they turned it around and say it's all China's fault. So it's just a gimmick, and China is far from angels. I think, as Rand has pointed out, that they're probably guilty of messing around with viruses and all this stuff. But I think what Nixon did by going over there, that was a big event. I'll tell you, when it was nothing but war and killing and all this stuff. And we had an opportunity. It's sort of like the opportunity we had when the Cold War ended with Russia and the Soviets. And we blew that, even though there's still remnants of the benefits from this. But we had, there was, I think, tremendous benefits by opening up the door with China, because I strongly believe what the founders believe, that if you trade with people and travel with people and share ideas, you're much better off and you're much less likely to start a shooting war. And right now we're moving in a direction that some people would like to. I mean, with Taiwan, people want to bomb them already. So make sure they never attack Taiwan. Well, you know, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.